Okay, so this is Nick Momont from Team Acer, and we're bringing you an interview with senior game designer David Kim on the StarCraft team. So, just to start things off, talking about Legacy of the Void. So, when you're making a new unit for StarCraft, do you prioritize balance, the current needs of the race, or thematic or lore-based considerations?
So on the StarCraft 2 design team, we think of three things as the most important, especially when it comes to multiplayer stuff. It's the fun, diversity, and fairness. So when we think of balance, we try to think of all these three things together, and it's not the fact that we don't try to make a call saying because this is fair, it's all good, even though it's not fun and it's not diverse. We try to have a good mix of the three in all areas throughout the course of the game.
Okay. So it's not really a priority-based thing. It's more just a balance between all of them.
Yeah, for sure. Because sometimes maybe the diversity factor is not as optimal as it could be, because the other two factors are so high, maybe it's okay. But other times we just want to generally kind of keep that three very strong, no matter what issue we're talking about.
Okay. So the thing that immediately comes to mind is the changes to the swarm host, because they kind of did take a while to come in, because you could say that with the old swarm host the game was still very balanced, but not exactly fun at times.
So I think that's a good example of that, and I think looking back we should have acted much quicker on it, but the reason why we couldn't, or reason why we didn't, is because it only happened at this specific region and skill. It was very common in the European skill level, European region. We were seeing it more so on the ladder especially, and we saw it maybe once or twice per year. But we kind of hoped, because we didn't see so much of it in Korea, for example, we kind of hoped it leans one way or the other. So if it kind of goes more towards across the whole pro level, if everyone's using swarm host that way, then we can react and then patch real quick, versus if it leans the other way, maybe we didn't have to do anything. So we were kind of waiting to see if it would go one way or the other, but it didn't, and it kind of stayed there for such a long time, so it was kind of difficult for us to choose when do we step in. But looking back, we feel like we should have done something about it much sooner than
Okay. Makes sense in hindsight, but I guess it's hard to make that call on
for sure.
on the spot. Okay, well, you actually kind of already answered my second question, but next one that I got is what are you planning in terms of post-launch Legacy of the Void patching? Will balance changes or even maybe content updates be common?
So we're talking a lot about what to do after Legacy of the Void, but there's nothing really set in stone yet, because we're so busy just focusing on Legacy of the Void, focusing on the beta and getting that out the door. So for now, it's very difficult to say what the next step is, but we're definitely having discussions around that internally.
Okay, very good, very good. And do you ever envision a day in the future when you can just say the game is done and it no longer requires anything like a balance patch?
I don't think so. Not at this day and age, because there's constantly new players coming in, new strategies being developed by the pro teams and the pro players who are competing, as well as we have such a robust community of, say, like Reddit or Team Liquid, things like that. So all the time, new things are being discovered. So I don't think there is a world where we're done and StarCraft 2 is perfect and we can just leave it be. I think it has to be the fact that we have to constantly look at how the game is going, and if there are new issues that pop up because of one or more of these factors, then we have to consider those and so on. But I do think there will be a time when patches are much slower, because things are being discovered at a much slower rate than they would be right at the start of the game launch or during the beta, things like that. But I don't think it'll be the case that, and it won't be anytime soon, that the game is just completely done and we can just leave it and move on, right?
So what do you think was sort of the magic of Brood War, where the game sort of was played at a competitive level for years and years after the last balance patch was made?
So that, I think, was not really by choice. It was just because of how it turned out. Because back then, we didn't have this robust community. We didn't have as big of a pro gaming scene that we do now. For example, it was really big in Korea, but outside of Korea, how many pros did you really see in Brood War, right?
Yeah.
So the Korean pro scene was kind of left with this no support from Blizzard, so they had to do their own thing by altering the maps and balancing the game that way. But I don't think that's the most ideal, but it's very impressive that they did that and the game kept going for so long just by tweaking the balance of maps. But we feel like we should look at the game from as many angles as possible, and sometimes there are solutions that are much better in the game than through maps, and vice versa. So just keeping track of that and just working together with those organizations, or Team Liquid map contest is another good example of something like this, is if we can just work at it together, whether it's pros, organizations, tournaments, the community, or us, if we can just all work together and then make StarCraft 2 last much longer than perhaps Brood War did, I think that's the best case scenario.
All right, that sounds excellent. Okay, the next one is, many people in the community are of the opinion that the amount of time it takes for Blizzard to respond to a balance concern is too long. Do you plan on reducing your response time? Why or why not?
So we actually get both sides of that argument. There are a huge group of players, especially the Korean players, I think generally feel this way. A huge group saying we should never patch. Like at most there should be one patch every year or every 2 years, because that patching kind of invalidates some of the practice that goes into their games. And the flip side of it is what you mentioned. So we get both sides of it, and I think it's important to kind of mention this because like it's not so easy as to do we just go in and patch so much and everyone's happy, because there's that other half that will be very unhappy also. So it's a good balance. But for us, I think our stance is we want to be a little more conservative with changes in StarCraft 2, because the skill factor in mastering the game we believe is much greater in StarCraft 2 compared to other games, compared to the balance changes that may occur. So in a game like Heroes of the Storm, if the skill component is like 50-50 with balance changes, then I think for StarCraft 2 it's more like 80% is the skill and practice of the players and 20% is the game balance that we can tweak. So because of that, we generally want to take our time to make sure that this is something that can't be overcome by practice before we go in and patch. So for now, I think this is correct, and if there are pressing issues such as the swarm host issue that we saw, then obviously we'll go in and try to act a little quicker on those types of issues. But for normal issues, I think we'll try our best to wait and make sure, and if we need to do that change, then we will.
Okay, so it sounds like sort of a common, you could say, sometimes troll response on online threads requesting for balance changes is kind of true. The just get better.
Yeah. It's not really troll, I don't think, because there is good arguments to patching frequently too, right? Because the other side of it is obviously what these guys are saying.
Yeah.
But both sides, I think, have very strong arguments. But for us, I think we lie kind of in between those two. So like we're not doing as few as like one patch per year, for example, which is the other extreme, and we're not going to be doing patches every month, which is the other extreme. But I think we fall somewhere in the middle of those two.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so to get back to Legacy of the Void, the 12 worker start in Legacy seems to be a big factor in the speeding up of the early game, almost to the point where you could say we're just catapulted into the mid game. Was it an intentional choice to reduce the number of early game options in Legacy?
So it wasn't an intentional choice to reduce the number of options, but more so, I guess, a bit of a side effect. But at the same time, we tried to locate the exact right worker count that we can use to speed up the game as much as possible without reducing too many choices, right? So, for example, for now, I think the 12 worker count feels good because, yeah, it's true that we've gotten rid of strategies such as maybe 6-pull, but we've also introduced a new strategy where you can actually go bailing nest very early on and do an all in that way. So while it's true that some choices were lost, I think newer choices were added, and I think the most important factor here is we cut maybe a minute and a half of downtime in all StarCraft 2 games, and I think that's kind of important because like how many times do you have to just follow the exact same initial game build order, whether it's you're watching or you're playing the games. We felt like that downtime was not that fun for players, so we took this bit of a risk, I guess, with this change, and I think so far in the beta it's turning out okay.
And do you foresee an update to the beta that could bring or could give players back some more early game options?
I think that'll naturally happen too, with the addition of new units and strategy. Like for example, Zerg players can now go Ravagers. Protoss players can go pretty heavy Adept, Harass, things like that. So I think just naturally a lot of early game options will appear. But because StarCraft is a type of game where players really figure out the ins and outs of the game so quickly, I think what's more interesting is not the number of early game options that people can do, but more so how can we change the game so that we have constant action throughout the course of the whole game, because the early side of things will be figured out fairly quickly compared to the mid or the late types of games. So yeah, while that's important too, and new things will naturally appear whether we build it in or not, I do kind of think the importance is the overarching picture of having action throughout the course of the whole game.
Okay, sounds pretty good. All right, and our last question. It's a commonly accepted idea that Protoss is punished the hardest out of all the races by the changes in the economy in Legacy of the Void, due to the fact that you have to expand faster and spread yourself out more. How do you or do you see this as an issue, and how do you feel about Protoss in the beta?
So we definitely agree when it comes to like getting your 4th expansion or 5th expansion. Protoss has the hardest time in Heart of the Storm, and I think they would currently as well. But because so many other factors were added, for example, adepts are very strong early game. The harassment using Warp Prisms are also extremely powerful, especially when you combo with Immortals or Disruptors when enemy air units haven't been out yet. So it's kind of difficult to just conclude that Protoss is just weaker because of it. But even though expansion-wise, I totally agree that that is the case that you said. But I think it'll be important to just evaluate the game as a whole, and it's a little bit too early to make that conclusion right now because we're still making changes to the game. But eventually, we'll have to figure that out and fix it before the game ships.
All right, great. So thank you for your time.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
Yep, this was an interview on TeamAcer.com.